Well, welcome everybody and thank you. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Richard Fortey, who is an emeritus merit researcher at the Natural History Museum in London. Richard served on the Council of the Royal Society between 2001 and 2003, and in 2006 he was awarded the Michael Faraday Prize for Excellence in Public Communication of Science. He's been president of the Palaeontographical Society, he's been president of the Geological Society of the British Isles, and he was also the Collier Professor for the Public Understanding of Science and Technology at the University of Bristol. This talk is related to his book, which was also televised. You may have seen the television series on the BBC. If you haven't, you're in for a real treat. You're in for a real treat anyway, because Richard has that wonderful wry sense of humour that it's a slightly sideways look at everything. His books are going to be available for signing in the Waterstones tent afterwards, and I'll remind you of that again when we have finished question time. But for now, I'd like to introduce Professor Richard Fortey.
Thank you, Jeff. It's good to be back here. I've been here a couple of times before with previous books, but this is the first time I've been invited by the Royal Society, I think. Jeff mentioned the things I spent my life working on in the Natural History Museum, trilobites. And just in case there's anybody here, heaven forfend, who doesn't know what a trilobite is, here's a trilobite. Now, the sad thing about trilobites, from my point of view, is that they're extinct. They are no more. It's a little frustrating as a paleontologist if you work on animals that are wholly extinct. So a few years ago, once I became better known as a science writer, I conceived the idea of going around the world looking at what Charles Darwin himself might have referred to as living fossils. Organisms that have changed relatively little, morphologically, I must emphasize that, the way they look, through long periods of geological time. And I thought this would be a rather good way of explaining the tree of life from a different perspective, not from the point of view of the fossil record, which I'd done before in a book called Life, an Unauthorized Biography, published more than 10 years ago now, but through animals that still survive, and plants. So that's what I did. A series of field trips, which we then replicated in sort of abbreviated fashion for the BBC4 TV series, also called Survivors. Well, where to start? This is where we start. On Delaware Bay, on an evening in May, when the horseshoe crabs come in to spawn. Why horseshoe crabs? Well, most scientists, not all, but most scientists believe that they are the closest living relative to the trilobites. So, this is my chance to go back and see my animals as near as we can. And I wanted to see this all my life, never had the chance. On a moonless night, warm nights in May, these crabs come out of the ocean in their millions. They're not crabs, of course, at all. They're an allied group to which the trilobites are also related. They come to lay their eggs. The females come and dig the sand up, lay large yolky eggs, which, for an arthropod, which are then fertilized by the males. And let's try this again. What's the evidence for their living fossilness? Well, there are plenty of horseshoe crab fossils and their relatives in the fossil record. I'm not going to show very many fossils, but I have to show a few. Those of you at the front, anyway, will be able to see a nice little horseshoe crab on the right and tracks going around a sort of big horseshoe shape. This animal died at the end of its tracks, and it was a contemporary of the dinosaurs. And you have to look very hard to see differences between this animal and the one I just saw on Delaware Bay. And they go back further than this. They go back at least the beginning of the group at more than 400 million years. Let's just have an idea about geological time. Life on the planet has been here preserved fossil at least for at least 3.5 billion years. So if we imagine the height of this room as being the length of the fossil record of life, it's only the canvas at the top that might represent the duration of human beings on Earth. And a couple of feet down, possibly, the first horseshoe crabs. Here's the male climbing aboard the female. Actually, that first slide was a bit of an orgy because not content with one male getting on the back of the poor old female, other males try and get their contribution to the gene pool by coming in sideways. So sometimes you get a poor old horseshoe crab female covered with 3 or 4 competing males, but they survive because they're incredibly tough. And that's the story too. One of the things I wanted to find out was some reasons why certain organisms might survive. How and why are some things likely to be survivors? Well, the horseshoe crabs have an extraordinary ability. Quite a lot of these animals became extremely damaged. I was surprised to see battered old wrecks, sometimes with holes right the way through them, stumbling along the seashore. You know, like I'd compare them to old Sherman tanks, like this sort of thing. Still able to carry on laying their eggs. The reason they're so tough is that they have very special blood. It's not red iron-based blood like ours at all. It's blue blood, copper-based. And this has an ability to coagulate in the presence of gram-negative bacteria very, very rapidly. And the result is that where it's damaged, you could even put a hammer right through the carapace. A kind of wall builds up to seal off the wound, and the animal can stagger on to carry on about its business. And this has proved extremely useful to human beings as a test for the presence of such bacteria. And for a while, horseshoe crabs were being milked for their blue blood. And it's still used very, very widely as a test. And that's another message that I kept on picking up as I looked at more organisms. You aren't around on this Earth for hundreds of millions of years without picking up a few biochemical tricks to protect you from attack. Many of these are, in a very selfish way, of interest to human beings. Another extraordinary thing about the horseshoe crabs, when they finish their night's work, the following day, all these birds come in to undo it, waders, on a long migration route from the tip of South America to the Arctic. They arrive starving, they gorge themselves on horseshoe crab eggs, they leave sometimes doubling their weight almost. But remember, these birds, in fact, this part of the bird clade, evolved after the extinction of the dinosaurs, when the horseshoe crabs were already ancient. So here we have an ecology which is absolutely linked in, but separated originally at least by hundreds of millions of years. It also means, of course, that the horseshoe crab, ancient though it is able to cope with the challenges that the modern environment and modern competition and predators and so on can throw at it. I'm just going to mention, and I'll mention it again, this, of course, is an intertidal habitat that we're looking at now, exposed mudflats at low tide and sand flats where the horseshoe crabs drag themselves in from the sea where they spend most of their lives. It's also good for the horseshoe crabs that everybody loves birds. More naturalists love birds than any other organism. As a horseshoe crab fan, I find that puzzling. But the North American equivalent of the RSPB has protected the horseshoe crab numbers. And indeed, every year they have a count, a census of horseshoe crabs to make sure that the population is keeping up to scratch. And if you take part in the count late at night, and it's a nice thing to do, with one exception, that Delaware Bay is the center of the mosquito population of North America. You will be awarded for your endeavors with a little pin, little pewter pin, this one. So if you ever meet somebody wearing one of those, you'll know exactly what they've been doing. I've never met anybody yet, mind. Anyway, the horseshoe crab is not threatened. It is in considerable numbers. It was a great thrill to see it. and takes us back several 100 million years, almost as far as the next animal, which I went to see inside a rotting log in New Zealand with George Gibbs, a local zoologist there who knew exactly where to find it. So if you break open these rotting logs, inside them you'll find this charming animal. It's a velvet worm, otherwise known as an onychophoran. In fact, my book, which is called Survivors in the UK, every time it's just been published in the States, and my American publisher always changes the title on principle. And it's published as Horseshoe Crabs and Velvet Worms in the States. So these are the velvet worms. Those of you at the front, and I hope at the back, can see its construction is rather peculiar. It's made out of lots and lots of little rings along the length of the body. Transverse rings like that. And even the antennae at the front and the legs are composed of similar rings. It's just like, do you remember the Michelin Man? It's like a kind of fine-scale version of the Michelin Man. And it's extremely flexible. You can, if you get hold of one, not too hard, you can pull them out like this, and you let go, and they go boing, like a bit like an old-fashioned accordion. Inside, they've got muscles that run along the length of the body. Most paleontologists and indeed zoologists that I know believe that these interesting and lovely creatures insert on the tree of life below the arthropods, below trilobites and insects and crabs and lobsters, all the things that Jeff and I like to study. So this is just one evolutionary step, or maybe more than one, below the arthropods on the evolutionary tree. So it's even more ancient, if you like. Fossils, yes. Yes, I hope. Can I? Ah, there we are. That's a fossil. Those of you at the front, well, even at the back, I hope you'll see the little ridges along the back, which are the expression of those little Michelin tires. You'll even notice a little pair of claws there, which the living animals still have. What they don't have is this structure at the front, which is a gill. Because like everything else, this group of organisms started under the sea, and in the case of the velvet worm, of course, moved onto land into its present habitat and became really quite a specialized organism today, but it's another survivor. And the land, moving onto the land in some way, protected it. This is a fossil from the very famous Cambrian Burgess Shale, which takes us back to well over 500 million years. So this lineage came through from that time. Actually, modern studies reveal that they were more diverse then, much more diverse than these velvet worms than they are now. So what we have is a little remnant, as with the horseshoe crabs, that has somehow come through in a specialized habitat to the present. Now, when I say come through, I'm particularly referring to two, perhaps more, major mass extinctions, where a lot of animals died out, and plants. The first and most traumatic of these was probably the end Permian one, about 250 million years ago, where 90% of Earth's species died. So our survivors, the ones I've been talking so far, have come through that major trauma. The next one everybody knows about, 65 million years ago, when a large bolide or meteorite collided with the Earth, exterminated the dinosaurs, and a lot else besides, but not these. They came through. So those, we've got to think of why or how possibly these animals coped with these traumas. Whoops, back. Got a mind of its own, this thing. So to the next animal. I'm now going to the new territories in Hong Kong. Again, you'll see in the background, you'll see the sea, and you'll see mudflats, or sandy mudflats. So we're in the intertidal zone once again. And Paul Shin, Chinese colleague, is digging in the mud there for a very special animal. Another one I've always wanted to see alive. It's not terribly spectacular. There it is. It's a brachiopod, not a mollusk, but a brachiopod called lingula, which means tongue, and you can see why. it's rather longer than the length of your hand, that specimen. And to find Lingula, you have to dig down into the mud, where it lurks, not quite in a burrow, but in a vertical position, pulled down by this fleshy stalk. Here, you can see, there it is. So that acts as a sort of anchor and pulls it down. When the tide comes in, it moves up, opens its little valves, there are two of them, of course, and filter feeds, takes out edible particles from the fresh food brought in every time the tide comes in. This is a habitat rich in food. When the tide goes out, it pulls down into the mud, closes its valves, and so on, and so on. Not a very exciting life, you might say, but certainly a durable one. In fact, one of the reviewers of my books said that the survivors were particularly stick in the muds. I know what he meant. But what I want you also to notice is that there are lots of snails and other things around here. In fact, that mudflat was alive with life. And a lot of that life, rather like the dowitchers and waders we've seen after the limulus eggs, is evolutionarily younger. In other words, Lingula can cope with things that arose on the tree of life much higher up. Now, Lingula goes also, like the velvet worm, back to the Cambrian. 500 million years plus its relatives. And some of the very early fossils I was quite familiar with, I collected in Wales, hammering rocks, look terribly similar, at least superficially. And they are pretty similar. Well, what's going on? It's not a very exciting lifestyle. The crucial thing about it is that the important thing about this habitat, A, it's intertidal, B, food isn't a problem, space is the problem. There were little gobies, all shrimps, mollusks, everything coping for space on the mudflat. Basically, if you can get a place to lodge, you'll survive. Now, that intertidal habitat is also extraordinarily stable, to the extent that it will always have existed somewhere. Now, the Permian crisis, the 250 million years one through which this animal came, was particularly one of oceanic anoxia. Large chunks of the ocean became starved of oxygen, and animals living there simply couldn't survive. The intertidal zone, however, must have been immune for that because the tide was still be coming in and out, storms would stir it up, and as long as the habitat persisted, then so would Lingula. It's not uncommon. It's found quite widely around the Pacific region. And this, I kept on coming back, because I can't give you all the examples in the book. You'll have to buy the book for that. But as I came back, time and time again, I found there was a habitat component in survival, and particularly intertidal ones. Well, we're just about where the projector is up on the ceiling in terms of the whole history of life. But of course, you can go back a lot further. There are greater survivors. And one thing I'd always wanted to do, and this book allowed me to do, and the telly, was to go and see the greatest survivor of them all, the Stromatolites. And I guarantee that's the only signpost in the world where you will see the word Stromatolites on a signpost. It's in Western Australia. It takes a long time to drive up there from Perth. And when you get there, there's a little road taking you to Hamelin Pool. And when you go down the Hamelin Pool Road, you go back into the pre-Cambrian. You go back to have a vision of what life was like, not just 500 million years ago, but billions of years ago. Well, they're sort of sticky cushions. And if you cut it inside one of these, you'll find they're finely layered, a bit like Filou pastry, if you can imagine that. The skin on top of those cushions is alive. It's a mat of blue-green algae, we used to call them, bacteria we should call them, and other very ancient organisms, a community really, that grows immensely slowly in the special conditions in Hamelin Pool. And this is a vision of Precambrian life. And the star survivors are to be found inside these stromatolites, or on the skin of the stromatolites. I might say this didn't appear on the telly programme. I showed it to the man at the BBC. I said, this is the most exciting thing I saw. And he sort of looked at it for 10 minutes and said, they don't do a lot, do they? So the BBC wouldn't fork out to go to Hamlin Pool. Anyway, the things in glorious technicolor are threads from living stromatolites, blue-greens with internal compartments. The brown-coloured things are fossils that have been miraculously preserved for, in this case, 2 billion, that's 2,000 million years. And, well, a guy who works on these things told me, well, you have to call them something different because of the different age, but really, there's morphologically very little to choose between them. So these are, super survivors. And they're more than that, of course. They are the most important organisms in the history of the planet, which is why I was hoping the BBC man would get excited, because they transformed the atmosphere from one that would have been inimical to any animals to one that we can all breathe and flourish in all animals, because the original atmosphere of the Earth had extremely small amounts, if any, of free oxygen. And of course, what those green threads do is photosynthesize, which involves building their own material, their carbon compounds, from using sunlight and carbon dioxide and exhaling tiny bubbles of oxygen. So this process carried on from almost the floor, not quite, well, certainly to 3/4 of the way up this tent. Nothing much else happening. It was a slow oxygenation of the atmosphere in pulses. It wasn't a straight line, as I once thought, but it went fast first and then flattened and then fast again. It transformed the world for us, you could say, if you're going to be horribly egocentric about it, but certainly for higher plants and animals. So arguably, these survivors are the most important of them all. Oops. Other important things happened. During this long period of time, this organism is a fossil again. It's called Bangiomorpha, and it's 1.3 billion years old, 1,300 million. And this is the first sexually differentiated organism we know. And as everybody knows, sex hots things up, allows for greater variation, speeds up the process of evolution. And this Bangiomorpha is extremely like one thread you have to think of here of a living red alga called Bangia. This is courtesy of my colleague Juliet Brodie at the museum. Same size, same differentiation to reproductive components. It's a survivor. But you can go right to the base of the tree if you want. You have to go back to a time when there was no oxygen and life liked hot water. And to do that, I had to, go to Yellowstone Park, where, of course, it's famous for its hot springs and geysers. And all these color bands around the edges of the hot springs are produced by archaebacteria, archaea sometimes, and related organisms that lie right at the very base of the tree. This is the first life we know about. And there are even disputed fossils of some of these. These are organisms that flourish in the absence of oxygen and at high temperatures. And most zoologists, or most biologists these days, believe that that's the conditions under which the first organisms, self-replicating organisms on Earth came about. So here they are, still finding a niche, because they never go away or never went away, in Yellowstone. And as the hot water spills out of the edge of these pools, you kind of go up the tree a little bit, because the bright green color here, familiar, of course, for photosynthesis, include some of the very first algal organisms, which must also have been very low in the plant tree of life. So we've gone down. I've started with my trilobite relatives, where I'm most comfortable, really. and move right down to the beginning, I might say that these very, very primitive organisms are not the most exciting to look at. In fact, that's about as exciting as they get. All right, let's take a big jump now to things that were contemporaries of the dinosaurs and have come through the big KT, as it's called, Cretaceous Tertiary extinction. This is a Nautilus, and beautifully carved. And unlike the things I've been talking about up to now, this animal is becoming more under threat because people love Nautilus shells as tourist trophies. It's not uncommon in large chunks of ocean off eastern Australia and near New Caledonia, but it's being overexploited for its shell. And this was a contemporary of the dinosaurs on land, and also in the sea. I'll just go back to that. These animals, ammonites, which were far more prolific and far more abundant and far more highly evolved. But they did not survive the KT. The Nautilus did. It's an octopus relative. You've got to imagine an octopus kind of stuffed into the edge of the shell, and with very good or very advanced looking eyes, quite sophisticated eyes, like the living octopus. The Nautilus bumbled on through the KT boundary, and I'm not quite sure why, whereas the ammonites, its much more evolved contemporaries, didn't. It may be to do with the fact that Nautilus produces relatively few young and lives to a great age, so it's got a long reproductive cycle, and some people think that the ammonites grew fast and reproduced only once, but that's a bit speculative. I might say that that's just to show you a fossil Nautilus. This is the only bargain I ever heard anybody get from the Beijing flea market, which is famous for selling fakes of everything. Even Chairman Mao tea trays are fake there. I was taken round the market by a friend of mine and past all the fake jade. And I noticed one of the jade stores had the jade necklaces all draped over this fossil. So somewhat to the surprise of the owner, I swept all the jewellery aside and said, "How much for the fossil?" And he gave me a very good price for it. And I'm sure this isn't a fake. That's a fossil Nautilus, about 150 million years old. And, well, I hope you can see how similar it is to the living animal. Well, is this the wind making this elegantly bob up and down? Gives it a sort of extra life appearance. You have to mention plants. If you want a model for what plants were like when they came out of the sea into fresh water and then onto muddy substrates and then onto land, you can't do worse than look at a liverwort. And you don't have to go anywhere special for liverworts. This was taken half a mile from where I live in Henley-on-Thames. They're still there in the same sort of habitat. Wherever you get a decent bit of mud, you can find them, I'm sure, somewhere around these tents here, if you look hard enough. They're simple synthesizing pads. They're taking the stromatolite, if you like, onto land, and they're really quite abundant. Most scientists that I know think that they were the first, or something very like them was the first thing to come out onto land, thereby transforming the land, just as the stromatolites before them had transformed the atmosphere. Once these things came out, you could have different ways of breaking down rocks to produce soils, and once you've got soils, well, the whole story changes. If you want to see the next stage, you can go and look for lycopodophytes. This is one called Hoopersia, which I photographed in Norway. You don't have to go to Norway, you can go to Scotland and see one. If you're a photosynthesizing pad creeping over the mud, the next stage to grab the light is to grow up and spread your canopy out, or leaf, your light-catching organs that way. And this is about as simple as they get. To do that, you need to have supports and water-conducting threads, which was a very important innovation. But the interesting thing is that although these organisms show a very early stage in that, if you like, they have successfully survived and competed with much younger organisms ever since. These also probably survived, well, did survive, both of the great mass extinctions. Probably because they live in a rather marginal habitat which always survived. That's a fossil one, much higher magnification of a thing with rejoicing in the name of Baraguanathia that shows many similar features. And that's at least 400 million years old. So plants can be survivors too. Or you can go higher in the tree to the dinosaur age, and this is one everybody will know, Ginkgo. But Ginkgo survived in just one small range of mountains in China, the Tianmushan Mountains. So one of the things that I really wanted to do was to go and see the Tianmushan Mountains to see where Ginkgo came through. Now, it's incredibly tough, Ginkgo. When it's now planted, of course, replanted all around the world. It was common all around the world, and it's an interesting question, and one I didn't totally grapple with, why it became so reduced. But presumably the KT conditions were so awful that just in a few special places could it survive. I might say that after Hiroshima, the one tree that survived and put out new shoots was the Ginkgo. And when I did the TV, we went to the most polluted street in New York to do the footage of Ginkgo. I got some funny looks from passers-by, I might say. Well, that's a fossil, just to show you how similar the fossil leaves are. And that's one of these ancient surviving Ginkgo trees in the Tianmushan Mountains. The Chinese aren't quite in agreement on why it survived. Some people think that we humans gave it a helping hand, and that the monks used to use, remember China was originally Buddhist, and the Buddha received enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, which was a fig, Indian fig, which doesn't grow in the Tianmushan Mountains. And they say, but the nearest thing they had to it in appearance was the Ginkgo tree. So it was planted around the monasteries for meditation purposes. Also, in this country, we mostly, those of you who know Ginkgo, will never see a Ginkgo fruit because we only plant the males. And the reason we do that is because the females produce a yellow fruit which is extremely smelly. It really does pong. And like everything that's sort of slippery and smelly, the Chinese think it's very good for long life. And they also play a game with the Westerners like me who try and pick up Ginkgo fruits in chopsticks because they're extraordinarily slippy. So you reach down with your chopstick and try and grasp the Ginkgo fruit, and it goes bing one direction, you have another go bing in the other direction before you finally get one into your mouth. They are also, of course, they are genuinely full of alkaloids. Again, it's this thing about something that's been around for a long time, learning a few chemical tricks. And some of those alkaloids are certainly of pharmaceutical interest. The most famous recent discovery, and this was one of my failures to see, the Wollemi pine was found in a valley in New South Wales, and these were trees that were 200 feet high. How they'd escaped attention, of course, is a wondrous thing. They were only discovered, I can't remember the exact year, certainly 10 years ago. I wanted to go there, but they're so rigorously protected that they wouldn't let me. But it didn't matter because I went to the local garden centre, and they're on sale now. You too can have a Wollemi pine. They've, rather like the Ginkgo, they spread the propagules around the world again. This was known first, I might say, from a fossil before it was found living, so it really is a living fossil. That was, again, a contemporary of the dinosaurs. Another thing I didn't see in the wild was the coelacanth, which for most people is the living fossil. I didn't think I'd succeed because they were having a sort of minor revolution in the Comoro Islands at the time. And anyway, it lives at great depth, so I'm afraid I had to go and see it in a glass case in the Natural History Museum. That's my only cheat. There's a fossil, just showed you again how extraordinarily similar the living coelacanth is to a Cretaceous fossil. Again, interestingly, like the Nautilus, this lives a very long time and lays very large yolky eggs, so it nurtures the young through a critical phase. a lot of marine organisms go for the quick mass propagule option, which is where you lay trillions of eggs, or certainly hundreds of thousands of eggs, with the idea that one might survive, and they're tiny. But both Nautilus and this guy seem to go for fewer, and indeed it's true of horseshoe crabs too, compared with many arthropods. They go for fewer eggs that are hatch at a more mature size, and they live for a longer time. It's a different strategy. All right, let's go down the evolutionary tree a bit, in time at least. Again, this is not an exotic place. This is to look at the origin of the vertebrates, the animals with backbones, us, and fish. And to find my survivor here, I went to the River Lambourne, which is a beautiful, pure chalk stream that flows down into the River Kennet in Berkshire. Lambourne, famous for its racehorses. And here's the Environment Agency boys doing their annual census of this chalk stream to monitor the health of the river. And it's still pretty healthy. And by a strange coincidence, I used to live in the same village, Boxford, through which they were doing their survey. And here's the charming little creature that we found. Again, most paleontologists and zoologists believe that this kind of fish-like animal precedes what you and I would normally think of as a fish. It's very different in all kinds of features of its anatomy. It doesn't have true jaws to start with, and its gill openings here are 7 discrete holes in a line. And the most primitive fossil fish-like animals had no jaws and didn't have conventional, what we would think of as conventional gills. Most lampreys live by, they have a rather unpleasant life habit of rasping with their no jaws. They have a strange rasping apparatus at the front and parasitizing other fish. And so it has to be the case, I think, that they hitched a lift. As long as there was another fish around that it could parasitize, it could hitch a lift through the great extinction crises. Again, you have a very special, in this case, a very specialized habitat, which probably endured to allow the organism itself to survive. But again, for zoologists, this is extraordinarily important because it's a still living creature that allows us to see the genesis of animals with backbones. And it's fantastically useful in studies of development and the expression of genes and all the stuff that's going on right now. So thanks to the survival of this organism, we've got a very, very useful experimental animal. Most people know that of the lamprey that King Henry I died of a surfeit of them. But history doesn't record how many a surfeit is, but it's presumably quite a lot. And another curious lamprey fact I discovered is that the city of Gloucester is supposed to send the Queen a lamprey pie as one of the conditions of their freedom. I suppose it's not that far from here, really, is it? Anybody eaten lamprey pie? No? No. Well, I thought it would be quite nice to eat lamprey. So I understood they still ate it in the Baltic states. So when I went to Lithuania on a British Council lecture, I found out the Lithuanian for lamprey, which is actually niege, in case you ever need it. And I spent a rather curious day wandering around Vilnius, going into restaurants, looking hopeful and saying, niege, niege, and they kind of looked at me as if I was balmy. And eventually I found somebody who spoke English, and he said, in my grandfather's time we eat niege, but not for 50 years. So I never ate a lamprey. How are we doing for time? So briefly, I also went to New Zealand to see, among other things, as well as the velvet worm, the famous Tuatara. looks like a lizard but isn't a lizard. It's lower than the lizard on the Tree of Life, and it survived in New Zealand, probably because New Zealand itself rifted off from the main body of Gondwana, carrying with it a cargo of survivors. Most of those survivors didn't, but this one did. I spent a long time, it's a famous animal in New Zealand. It's, you can find it on pubs. I spent many hours looking at it, waiting for it to do something, and it doesn't. I mean, it just sort of sat there. But apparently at night it will occasionally bestir itself and eat an insect, and then go back to torpor. But it lives for an enormously long time, and again we find this combination of habitat and longevity that seems to be part of the survivor formula. Well, I'll pass over that one rather quickly. The crocodile, which alone survived among the larger reptiles from the dinosaur era, but of course we all know that they can live intertidally. Anybody who's been up to Queensland, where I've just been, would know that. So we're back moving into this habitat that came through the KT, and of course they're also omnivores who can go without food for a long time, which is not a bad thing to be in that time of crisis. So, we're moving up the Tree of Life now. We've arrived at our own ancestors, the mammals. The most primitive surviving mammals are the egg-laying mammals, monotremes, and they too are refugees from Gondwana. They're found in Australia. Most people know the duck-billed platypus. Fewer people know well the echidna, its relative. So we went in search of an echidna. And that's the best photograph we got of an echidna on Kangaroo Island in South Australia. It's a lovely hedgehog-like animal, but it's, of course, nothing to do with a hedgehog. And it's got this funny little beak at the front, nose, if you prefer, which sticks out rather like a cigar from the front of the animal. And it's very hard to get a photograph of it. They're not uncommon if you're lucky. They can get to this sort of size, and they trundle along slowly by the side of the road. And if anybody who knows Australia, you'll know there are an awful lot of very spiny bushes there. So mostly you get the photograph of an echidna's bottom, all covered in spines, sticking out of a very spiny bush. So we did rather well to get that one. But I went in South Australia to see Echidna Lady, a woman who devoted, Peggy Rice-Miller, who devoted a lot of life to study of the animals, and she pointed out how remarkable these are as survivors. They don't have proper mammary glands like mammals. They just have a sort of bit of skin that oozes milk. But what milk? They lay eggs at the bottom of a tunnel, and then they produce little babies. Now, this is your R moment. They produce little babies called puggles. Thank you. And aren't they sweet? And the puggles stay in the burrows while mum goes off and searches not for ants, as the name spiny anteater might suggest, but for beetles and grubs and worms and all kinds of invertebrates, and then comes back and feeds the puggle. And the milk is so rich, it's so rich that it's of interest pharmaceutically, again, in the treatment of anorexia. Nothing more nourishing is known. And eventually, these are rather slowly brought up. They go off and live quite a long life, much longer than the hedgehog they superficially resemble. So again, we got a long-lived animal, absolutely charming creature. I won't say much about the duck-billed platypus because he's been much talked about. But I never saw one alive in the wild although I went to look for them several times in my life, until we did do the BBC programme where they sort of staked it out. Right. So we've gone through to the mammals. I'm now going to look at the last part of the survivor story, which is, as you know, we have come out of a great climatic crisis, the last ice age, just a few thousand years ago. And the ice age produced all kinds of special species because of the climatic change it induced. So another class of survivor are things that survived the ice age. The ice age did several things. One of the things it did was isolate at certain points oceanic islands where evolution could proceed and produce endemics. A lot of those endemics have already gone. As just one example of an endemic that hasn't, I went to see in the mountains of Mallorca, in permanent water pools, lives a wonderful animal called the Mallorcan midwife toad. And those of you who know Mallorca might be surprised there's any permanent water there at all. It's only where there are scour pools with no cracks in, so the water can't drain out. And there's a nice man called Pignard researching these animals. Eventually found something. They're known locally as the ferret, which means iron worker, because they have a funny little noise, sort of ding, ding, ding noise, which sounded like somebody tapping an anvil. They're beautiful. But these toads is one of the few creatures where the adult is actually smaller than the tadpole. Tadpole takes about 5 years to get to maturity, and they're huge. And this little squitty adult comes out at the end of the day. And this survives in a few redoubts in the Majorcan mountains. And a lot of these things, and human beings, of course, have accelerated this process enormously. A lot of island organisms are dying out right now in what is sometimes called the sixth mass extinction, and it's our fault mostly. Anyway, that's the ferret. Of course, a lot of organisms evolved to cope with the cold, and as the climate warmed up at the end of the Ice Age, they too became vulnerable. So many Ice Age mammals, or things that appeared in the Ice Age and flourished there, are now extinct. And many people, of course, invoke human interference with that process too. And there's a big ding-dong that's been going on as long as I've been a paleontologist between the climate change lot and the we humans did it lot. The truth probably is that when climate change reduced the populations, it made it easier for us humans to push something all the way. But there are some survivors, and here's one of the lucky ones, the bison, which I also, of course, caught up with in Yellowstone, which is where one of 2 or 3 places where it survived this. The pile there is bison skulls. The appearance of the automatic rifle allowed for a slaughter unprecedented in history. And very few survived. They could have been pushed to the end like the American passenger pigeon, but fortunately, Yellowstone was so remote, they survived there. Bronx Zoo had some as an exhibit, and they survived there. And there was a farmer, whose name I've forgotten, who thought they were rather nice and kept some as pets. And from that, they've been bred back, thank goodness. A wonderful animal, beautifully adapted to cold conditions. Another one, the ibex. Well, that went up. It can live on the most remote and craggy areas you could possibly imagine. I imagine that was also pushed fairly close to extinction. Of course, it does feature on the wonderful artworks that our fully human ancestors produced. And I went to see muskox and various others that were the lucky ones from this particular period of history. Not so lucky, but only by a whisker, was the ancestor of today's cattle, the auroch, which survived in the Polish forests, Ice Age style forest, if you like, right up to the time of Shakespeare. Shakespeare could have written an ode about one if he'd known. But that just didn't make it. So there's the whole question of what we humans are doing to halt the progress of some of these remarkable animals. Now, in the book, I coined the term time havens for places where there's a particular concentration of these early organisms. I've mentioned China already, but I just didn't see just the ginkgo when I went to China. I found that there were Chinese ranges of mountains that were full of survivors, like magnolias, which are the earliest, among the earliest of the flowering plants, living alongside ginkgos. So my thesis would be that there are places like the intertidal and these mountains which probably have habitats that allowed the continued existence of well-adapted organisms to pass through these major geological crises. These organisms, the survivors, have a great deal to tell us about evolution, of course, but they may also prove useful in the most practical of ways as yielding biochemicals of use in fighting cancer or antibiotics and the like. So I would finish, as I hope is proper, on a conservationist note to say, let's save the survivors. One or two most people don't want to save, I'm afraid. The cockroach is possibly everybody's least favorite survivor. In fact, in all my researches, I was only able to find out one group of people who liked cockroaches. They were miners in the silver mines of Bohemia. And the reason they like cockroaches is, cockroaches, as everybody knows, can live very happily in small cracks from which they come out to forage on almost anything. Well, these miners used to know about impending rockfalls when all the cockroaches fell out of their cracks and scuttled towards the door because they got very sensitive pressure detectors. So the miners alone like the cockroach. But one thing I'm absolutely certain about is that when human beings finally finish themselves off, as we will, the cockroaches will be there to clear up the mess. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Yes, we have a few minutes for questions. And can I ask you, when you put your hands up, to just wait a second, because we have 3 roving microphones and we need just a minute to get the microphone to you. And the first one is just over there.
In another million years, when humans as we know us have gone, what do you think will be the survivors that the people from some other planet will be looking at?
Well, I'm sure, I'm sure it will include cockroaches. Well, I mean, I haven't talked, because plenty of other people will, about the sixth-mass extinction. What we're doing is rather different from some of the other ones, in that we're culling particularly things that threaten our livelihood or sit at the top of the food chain, i.e. the predators, the major predators, as well as overfishing the next layer down in the food chain monstrously at sea. So I don't think, some people talk about learning lessons from the past, as if by looking at the Cretaceous, Tertiary, or the Permian, we can learn something about what's going to happen in our reign, as it were. I don't think that's very appropriate, because we're doing different things than have happened in the past. The only thing I think might be relevant is the fact that there's a lot of evidence of pouring too much stuff into the sea that may induce one of these oxygenation crises, particularly in the context of global warming as well, or global increase in temperature, in which case we might see a replay of some of those terrible effects that the Permian had, where the seas went bad. I mean, let's hope not.
Over here, over on your left.
Right.
You mentioned about the lampreys surviving the KT disturbance because of their ability to rasp the flesh from fish. But they preceded the fish. Would their rasps be able to cut through the carapace of trilobites and things like that? Or what would they have fed on before fish existed?
That's a very good question, one I should have made clearer. The lampreys belong to a large group of jawless fish, of which they are the sole survivors. The early jawless fish, which were contemporaries of trilobites, were probably had not developed that sophisticated lifestyle. They mostly grovelled around in mud, sucking up small animals and other edible particles. And the lampreys themselves, that group, probably didn't appear until jawed fishes, the more advanced fish group, had come into existence. And they were, what should we say, a lucky offshoot from the original group. They have a relative that's still there at present in deep oceans called the hagfish, which is probably even nastier. It's a slimier version of the lamprey, which appeared at about the same time, but also very close to the tree of vertebrate life. So, and this is something I should have emphasized at the beginning. Nothing ever stays completely unchanged. The genome of some of these organisms is known to have changed and continue to change. It's the morphology, the way they look, that stays largely the same. And which is largely a case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know, it's a successful design that can do a successful thing, and as long as the habitat persists, then so will they. But the jawless fish have changed and evolved within that group. Thank you.
There's one right at the front, and then one.
Ferns are one of the oldest plants on Earth, and I just was very interested in that slide with the upward moving plants that were moving up to get the oxygen, and I just wondered if that was a kind of precursor of the fern.
Yes. Yeah, I couldn't put every survivor in, or this lecture lasts for 4 hours. But yes, ferns are indeed, or some ferns at least, are survivors from the same time, just after those lycopods. And ferns survive now very well in the shadow or in the understory of other plants. And again, that's a habitat. One of the things, I mean, it's logical really. You're a flat photosynthesizing pad. You grow up into something that can spread leaves out. How are you going to go next? You're going to go up and compete with your fellows. The appearance of wood allowed for the invention, shall we say, of trees, which actually have been invented, as it were, a number of times. That then creates a habitat underneath, which is where ferns are specialists. And ferns, of course, are one of the great survivors. After the KT, extinction event, there's the so-called fern spike in the rocks. The ferns had a field day. Everything else had gone away. Their spores allowed them to propagate widely, and they grew up out of every crack. And once again, you could say that very briefly, the evolutionary clock was turned back to the Carboniferous, and the world was covered with ferns.
There's one at the back and then over there.
One of the keys to letting these species be highly adapted is living in very unspecialized environments. For instance, the coelacanth lives in the deep sea. You mentioned a lot of species live in the intertidal zone, and these species surviving in those high Chinese mountains you talked about. Would you say living in unspecialized environments is the key to being a living fossil? Because generally those species that live in very unspecialized environments with very interconnected relations are very vulnerable to mass extinctions.
That's a very good point. Of course, you can say, what is specialization? Lingula, that little humble shell that lives in the mud, is doing a very specific thing in a very specific habitat, and the habitat lasts, and so does it. But, to agree with the other part of your question, co-evolution, which has been a tremendous feature of the last 70 million years, as, for example, between an orchid on the one hand with a flower that can only be pollinated by one particular bat or insect with a tongue long enough, on the other hand, those sorts of very, very highly advanced, specialized co-evolutions are vulnerable because one or other party can finish it off. If you're just filtering out small particles from seawater, that's a habitat that is not interlinked with the life habits of some other organism. Parasites, I guess, are enduring, but only so long as the relationship persists. If something goes wrong with it, both the parasite and the host is probably finished. Yeah. So, yes, good question.
Final one over there.
Talking of co-evolution, could I please ask you to comment briefly about the potential hypothesis for the symbiotic evolution of mitochondria and chloroplasts from a bacterial ancestry? Yeah,
I didn't mention that at all for reasons of time, really. I mean, yes, I think from being a way out idea when I was a young man, promulgated by very few scientists, I think everybody now agrees that this is what happened. And in a sense, the chloroplast, which was once a free-living bacterium, is itself a survivor inside a more complex cell. So yeah, and I believe, some people think everything around to the Golgi bodies was also once living independently. So yes, those are survivors tucked away inside other cells. So the survival, what I wanted to get away from was that some people have this idea that life is rather like a conveyor belt that moves ever onwards and upwards. And they always put it in those terms of upwards, don't they? But actually, already by the Cambrian, a lot of the life habits that we think of as typical of today's ocean had already appeared. And life is about, as well as invention, it's also about survival, even at the cellular level, as you point out. Thank you. Good point.
Okay, so I have a few thanks. I'd like to thank the festival and the Royal Society for putting on this event. I'd like to thank the technical support. Brilliant. Well done, guys, and the microphone people. I'd particularly like to thank Richard. That was an excellent talk, going from bottom to top of the evolutionary tree of life and visiting all sorts of interesting places and interesting organisms on that tree of life to give us a view of what is one of the really important phenomena, the survival of some of these really ancient forms of life that gives us a unique insight into unraveling the history of life on this planet. So thanks, Richard. I'd like you all to thank Richard again.